Okay, so today we're going to talk about hidden communication cues. My name's Karen Chung. I'm from the UK, just outside of London, and I have been trained as a trainer in something called NLP, which you may or may not have heard of. It's not natural language processing, which is a buzzword right now with AI. It stands for neuro-linguistic programming. And neuro-linguistic programming is all about how we communicate, how we process information in our own minds, and how we communicate not just with others, but also with ourselves. And it's used for lots of different reasons, but it's basically everyday common sense in some ways, but common sense that needs to be said in some ways. You'll see. And we're going to talk about the hidden communication cues, because there's so much information that's actually not explicit in our communication, but is very, very important. And the more we understand about that, the more effective our communication can be. So let's press on. In the next hour, we're going to understand those hidden communication cues, what they mean. I would, as I said earlier, like to make this interactive. So I will put you into a couple of groups for you to get kind of practicing some of this stuff, because the best way to learn is to do. So we're going to have a couple of breakout sessions and the opportunity to therefore share that learning. And in essence, we're going to take a sneak peek underneath the surface. We're all icebergs, metaphorically. We see each other's words and each other's actions, but we don't see our thoughts. We don't see the processes. We don't see the beliefs, the fears, and other things that are going on in the background and hidden in here. And often we don't even know ourselves, a lot of the unconscious thinking that goes on. And we don't fully realize that we're leaking a lot of information that if someone knew what they were looking for, could understand more about how we're thinking and what we're feeling. Because in essence, we cannot fail to communicate, okay? Even when we're doing nothing. If we're doing nothing, we're still saying something. We're standing in the corner of a room, minding our own business, being very quiet. We're still giving off non-verbal communication signals. We're still saying something. So it's interesting to know that people are getting stuff from us all the time, but what are they getting? And are we consciously aware? A lot we're not. Because there was a study done in 1967 which came about saying that 93% of our communication is non-verbal, not so much the general meaning of the words that we're using, but way beyond the meaning, beyond the words, beyond the physicality of communication. And it's really about how we say what we say, not so much what we say. So we're going to delve into more, we can talk about some of the words we use, but really what they mean. So first thing first, tell me, what do you see in this picture? You may have seen it before. You may not have. But either way, what do you see? A woman. Yep. How old is the woman? Young or old? Young. Cool. Anyone else? What do the rest of you see? A young woman. Ah, you see two women. Excellent. Excellent. Yep. See two young women. That's interesting. That's an interesting one. Does anybody here see an old woman? Anyone see an old woman? A young and an old woman. Good. That's better. That's right. Now we're all looking at the same picture, aren't we? But have a look at it a bit more closely. Yeah, you can see it now, hey? Have a look a little bit more closely. The young woman is looking to the left and the old woman is looking to the left as well. The young woman, if you're seeing the young woman, Yeah, it took a while, Marina. Yes. If you see the young woman, um, her ear is facing this way, isn't it? And that ear is the eye of the older woman. And the neck, the choker on her neck of the young woman is actually the mouth of the older woman, who is also facing that way. And the bonnet that both of them are wearing is the same. And the nose of the younger woman is actually a little knob on the older woman's nose, which comes down to the chin of the younger woman. Everyone can see both faces now. Interesting, isn't it? It's interesting how we look at the same picture, but we see different things instantly. And when we start looking at it a little bit more detail, you actually you like the younger woman better, yeah. If you look at it in a little bit more detail and look closer, you actually see something different. So we're going to delve into a little bit about how we're thinking and how we think differently, because there are a lot of hidden layers to our communication. And what I like to, I like this quote by Bob Gass. He says, "What we see and hear is what we think. What we think is what we feel. What we feel influences our reactions." Just hiding this a little bit because the text box covers it. And our reactions become our habits, and it's our habits that determine our destiny. So it all starts with what we see and hear. It's the sensory world that's around us. We take in information using our senses. Okay. We also process information internally in our brain using our senses. And that's where we're going to start. Our thinking styles. You may well have heard that people think in different ways. They do. We process information in different ways. Some of us process information visually, some of us auditorily, some kinesthetically, and others in an auditory digital manner where we actually kind of process things more logically. Now, we have a dominance in a certain style of thinking. And that dominance is often visual, sometimes auditory, kinesthetic, or auditory digital. And that dominating way of thinking kind of sets the tone for the way we think in generally. And it's also conveyed in a lot of different things. So one of them is, yes, the way we process information. So when we think about information or we think about something, if you're visual, more primarily visual, you'll think in images. You may not realize that, but subconsciously your brain is working looking at images and accessing images to recall things. If you're thinking auditorily, it's more to do with the sounds. And kinesthetically, it's more to do with feelings and touch, physical feelings and internal feelings. And auditory digital, it's about logic. It's about that internal dialogue, that's that conversation that's going on inside your head. But in addition to the images that you might see as a visual thinker, you also leak out how you're thinking. And if you can understand how somebody is thinking, that can help you communicate quite effectively with them. So someone might say, yes, I see what you mean. Or someone might say, yeah, that sounds about right. Or, yeah, I feel that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a feeling that is the right thing. Or I can grasp what you're saying. And an auditory digital thinker might say, yeah, that makes sense. Now, all those phrases are very common phrases that we hear all the time. But those phrases are related to how we're thinking. If you weren't thinking with a visual plane inside your mind, you wouldn't say, I see what you mean. Because you're basically relaying, as we said before from Bob Gass's quote, what we see in here leads to what we're thinking. we see and hear it inside our mind on an unconscious level. And that is leaked out because there's so much stuff that's leaked out in how we're thinking that we don't consciously know. So next time you hear somebody say, yeah, that sounds about right, then you know, they're not thinking in a visual way. They're not thinking with images in their head. They're translating and processing their thoughts in an auditory manner. So therefore, if you're talking visually to them, it's not going to be a connect. I'm sure you've all been in situations where you've been talking the same language to somebody, but actually they just don't quite get it. There's a disconnect somehow. This can be one of the reasons why somebody is thinking in a visual way, and in order for them to really understand what you're saying, they need to hear visual words from you. And if you're talking in a more kinesthetic way, because you're connecting more with your feelings, because that's your preferred style, then there's a disconnect. Okay. And there are other components to this, which I'll come on to in a minute. What I want to do is to get you thinking about this, because our eyes never lie. You've maybe heard that phrase. And our eye movements can tell us how somebody is thinking. So we've said before that there's people that primarily think in a visual way, people that think in an auditory way, people think kinesthetically, and people that think more digitally. Okay, but that information is leaked out, not just in our words, as I've mentioned before, but also in our eye movements. Okay, we access information without internally, and unconsciously we use our eyes, or we don't use our eyes. Unconsciously, our eyes move based on how we're accessing that information. So there's no right and there's no wrong in all of this. There's, everybody's just different. Okay, how we process information internally is how we process information, and there isn't a right or a wrong way, but it's leaked out and it's shared with us in a way that most people don't see. And if we can identify those hidden cues of communication, we can massively improve the way in which we connect with people, the relationships that we have with people, the influence, the ability to persuade them to our point of view and get them to really hear and understand what we're trying to say. And so what I'm trying to share with you today is an outline and some of the keys to understanding some of the components, some of the hidden components in our communication that are visible. So, as you can see here, we've got eye accessing cues, and eye accessing cues suggest that when we look in certain directions, when we're thinking, it's telling us how we're processing that information. So when people are looking up, they're processing in the visual field. So before they say something and they're accessing maybe a memory or a thought, they will tend to look up, and they will look possibly to the left, possibly to the right. Now, this says in a normally organized person, most people that when they're visually looking, thinking about something, they will look up to their left. And when they look to their left, you will see it to your right, obviously. And if they're constructing a visual thought, they're imagining something, making it up, maybe lying, they will be looking up to their right, your left. If they're accessing information auditorily, they will be looking to their left if they're remembering something, looking to their right if they're making it up, if they're imagining it. And if they're connecting with their feelings, they will tend to look down. So they will look down to their right generally if they're kinesthetic, if they're connecting with their feelings, and left if they're accessing something a bit more digital and using their logical processing. Take a note of this because I want us to do an exercise now, and I want you to split into groups where you actually look at somebody. So I know that let me just see who's all on here. Now, there's not many of you that got your cameras on. Are you guys happy? I know that obviously there's different circumstances. Are some of you happy to put your cameras on so that we can actually see your faces and see your eye movements? Would any of you mind putting your cameras on? If not, Sam, you've got your camera on. You're the only one that's got your camera on today. So I wanted us to get into little groups to look at eye movements, but if not, we'll get into groups for something else in a minute. But Sam, would you mind? Would you mind if you kind of participate? Oh, MJ, there you are. Lovely to see you too. And anyone else that's willing to put their camera on, that would be brilliant. No, I understand. Obviously, it could be like early hours of the morning, you could be in bed, you could be, just not ready for anyone to see you. That's fine. Oh, how do you pronounce your name? Oh, that's a. But thanks for putting your camera on. Okay. Some cameras swap left and right. Yes, I know. But so basically, if you have your camera on, that's fine. And as you've said, the visually constructed and the visually remembered information, some people are different. They're not all organized in this way. So you have to figure out what's right for that person. Don't make any assumptions, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to go into a little exercise. And what I will do is put you into groups. How many are there of you here? Okay, so we'll put you into little groups of 3 or 4, I think, and we'll get in each group. I'll just make a note of who has got cameras on. We'll have somebody with cameras on, and then we can follow the exercise. Right, so this is the exercise. Okay, so we're going to basically be looking to identify what how that person is thinking. Are they thinking in a visual way? Are they thinking in a auditory way? Are they thinking in a kinesthetic way? How are they connecting with their thoughts? Now, we access that information, as I said before, using eye access cues. We use our eyes, even though we're not externally using our eyes, we're using it internally to access that information. And we can figure out what people are doing, how they're accessing that information, whether they're visually doing it, kinesthetically doing it, or auditory doing it, by asking them some simple questions. So what I'd like you to do is to basically, within your groups, those that with cameras on, if you're happy, to kind of like look a little closer to the camera so people can see your eyes, and then for somebody within the group to ask the question to that person with the camera on. Just take note. What happens with their eye movements? Where do they move their eyes just before they answer the question? Where are they thinking? Because remember, the thought comes before what we see and what we hear comes before the thought. So we're going to access that information in our mind's eye or in our ears before we actually able to think what we're going to say. Okay, so you just before they actually say something, where have they moved their eyes? Just fleetingly maybe, but where did they move their eyes? And maybe just after what they say as well. Ask the question and just note what they did with their eyes. And then ask each of these questions and see what you make of it. Okay, it will give you an idea of whether you yourself are accessing kinesthetically, or whether, kinesthetically with your thoughts, whether you're accessing visually by looking up one way or the other, or auditorily. And these questions are kind of designed. You've got the memory recall. So the memory recall questions as remembered events. So that's not, you're not making that up. You remember those events, and when you access that memory, then you're going to be looking in a certain way, and that eye accessing movement will indicate how you're thinking. The creative thought is when you're actually constructing a thought, and then you have to look in the opposite direction to probably where you look, or in the opposite direction of where you were looking before, to recall an information. So that if you can understand where somebody looks when they're recalling and when they're making things up, you can tell if somebody is maybe not quite telling the truth, maybe fabricating something a little bit, or they're coming up with some ideas, and you can see if someone's looking down, they're connecting more with their feelings. So is that clear with everybody? Are we okay with that? Just take note, ask the questions. I will copy these questions and post them into the groups so that you get to see it, and then you can just follow the questions and just make some notes, have a little conversation. I'll give you about 6-7 minutes to do that, okay? And we'll come back and kind of recap. Is that okay? Yeah? Lovely. Okay. Right, let me get out this, and then I'm going to put you in some groups. So I'm going to put you in groups.
Karen, can I ask a question for you?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry I missed the first 10 minutes. So if I want to be more self-aware. So if I'm looking to the upper left when I'm speaking, am I trying to recall something? Am I fabricating it, or is I'm just trying to understand based on your slide, whose vantage point that is and how I can be more self-aware.
Okay. The point is not you're not trying to look in certain directions. It's what you naturally do. It's how you will unconsciously be processing information inside your mind. And your eyes give it away by where they move. Okay. So it's about understanding whether, when you think, if I ask you a question, okay, so if I said to you, so what did you have for breakfast this morning?
Dosa.
Okay. Anybody else? Did you see what happened? Did you see some eye movements happening there? Yes. You moved, didn't you? Your eyes moved that. I don't know. The cameras go opposite direction. So your eyes moved, yes, and that meant that you're recalling some information, because I was asking you a question, which was a question that you're not going to make up. You're just going to think, what did I have for breakfast yesterday? I'm trying to remember. So you're accessing a memory, and you're recalling information, and you moved your eyes automatically, unconsciously, in a certain direction, in a certain way, and that meant that you were accessing that information in that way. You were looking to the side rather than looking up, so maybe perhaps more auditorily than visually inside. Okay. So the point is that if I were to ask you to look down when you're being asked that question, it will be hard for you to answer the question, because you can't access that information necessarily kinesthetically. You access that information auditorily. But it's like yesterday I was doing this with my sons at the dinner table, and my two sons were looking at each other, and one was looking at the other, but then he was asked the question, and he was looking up. He was looking up to his left to try and remember what the answer should be to that question. And my other son was saying, no, look at me, look at me, look at me. And the one that was being asked the question couldn't access the information he needed to access because he wasn't looking internally in his visual field. He was being asked to look in front of him. He couldn't internally access and recall that information by looking up to his left. Does that make sense? So the point is, how do we access our information, and how can we identify how other people access their information? Because if we're more kinesthetic naturally, if we think more with our feelings than we do with that visual field in our mind, and we're talking to somebody who is thinking in a visual way, then they're going to be thinking in pictures and imagery, and we're going to be thinking with our feelings and connecting in a different way. And when we're talking, we're almost like talking a different language. Okay, so the more you can understand about how other people are thinking, and therefore how to connect with them on their plane of thinking, then you're going to be far further ahead in terms of the quality of your communication with that person. So the point of this is to understand how you're thinking, and also to be visually aware of how other people are thinking, because that can affect the way you communicate and the quality of the communication that you have with them. Does that make sense? I'm glad you see that, Marina. How can we tell if someone is lying? Well, if you can identify how they access the information, which side they look to, if they're lying, or which side, if they're constructing information, or which side they're looking to if they're remembering information, then you will know if they're making something up or they're recalling an actual memory, because you'll know which side they look to, and they can't hide it, because internally we do that. We have to look in a certain direction. We have to connect with that thought in a certain way, and our pattern of connecting, if we can identify that and we can identify that in others, then we will know if someone's, they're remembering it, or no, they're making that one up. They're not connecting with a memory. They're connecting with a construct, a visual and auditory construct. They're not thinking. So you will know. That's how you know, Sheila.
Nice.
Let me just share my screen, because I've got so much I want to share with you guys today. Okay. Right, so let's get this back on the road. Right, so you can see my screen. So that was the exercise we did. Did that work? Were you able to identify where people were looking? And did you kind of notice people's eye movements and how they moved? It is interesting, isn't it? It's fascinating when you understand that actually we're leaking information all the time. We can't not unconsciously. We're doing it because we have to think, and the way we're thinking is portrayed in some of the things that we do and how we do it. And if you understand what you're looking for, you can understand a lot more about the person that you're talking to. So, right, moving on to the next slide. Okay, so this gives you a lot more information. There's a lot of information in this slide. I expand it out as much as possible to give you that full picture. So I've said there's 4 kind of dominant ways of thinking: visually, internally, auditorily, kinesthetically with our feelings, and auditory digital in a more logical sense. And that means that, like, a visual thinker is thinking in pictures, but they also have there are other cues that you can pick up on to understand how they're thinking. They may talk a little faster. They're quite fast talkers. They're good at seeing the big picture in things. They like to see written instructions. They might notice particular details in appearance. The language cues they talk about, they actually use words that reflect the way they're thinking. So yeah, that looks good to me. I disagree with your point of view. they're viewing something, they're seeing an image. I can see what you mean. Those kind of words are saying that they're thinking with a visual field. Okay. And then also there's other cues too, the physical cues. People who are visual generally are looking kind of up and upwards when they're thinking, as you saw before, but they tend to be a bit more upright. They might be more gesture more with their hands. You can see I'm using my hands quite a lot here. So I'm probably thinking in a more visual way at the moment. And they perhaps care more about aesthetics because they think predominantly with their visual field internally. And so they're more into the visual, they're more into how things look than how things feel. Make sense? So if you're talking to somebody and you just start to notice the words that they're using to describe stuff, are they using visual words? Are they talking quite quickly? Do they need to see things? Are they using their hands a lot? How do they appear? What are they wearing? How presentable do they look in that way? Do they care a lot about how they look? And you can tell whether people are therefore more visual. And if they are more visual and you are not, okay, then in order to really communicate well with them, you need to kind of adapt your style of communication to match their style of communication. Okay, so this screen shows you about the key cues, the kind of unconscious cues that are visible to anyone if you know what you're looking for. And now you know that if you connect to somebody who's talking more slowly, and they like to touch things, they kind of like to feel things. Some people, just very touchy-feely. Some people just like to go around and touch things, almost as if they're taking in that particular thing that they're touching, but they're thinking, because they think in a kinesthetic way, physically. They like a hands-on experience rather than to see things visually. So they like to experience the world. So you've heard of probably visual thinkers and kinesthetic thinkers, auditory thinkers. It's all along the same lines. Yeah, so you can understand how people think. It's not that we don't think in other ways. We do use all of these. We have the ability to access all of these different thinking patterns, but we tend to have a dominant one. And if you can understand the dominant thinking style of somebody, or the style that they're using at the point in time when you're talking to them, then you can really make that connection really, really well. So an auditory thinker will might say, yes, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, that sounds good to me. That resonates with me. They're all kind of sounds. They're all sounds. They're connecting their thinking through their auditory plane. They're not seeing what you're saying, they're hearing what you're saying. Whereas the kinesthetic thinker feels what you're saying. That feels right. Yes, I grasped what you're saying there. Does that make sense? That grasp, that's kind of like a very physical kinesthetic word, as opposed to I see, which is a visual word. And then the auditory digital person wants to make sense of it. So if something doesn't make sense, they'll say that doesn't make sense. Yeah. Or that does make sense. So they're thinking more logically. So now listen to the words people are using. Take note of how quickly they're speaking, because the kinesthetic person takes longer to process their thoughts and therefore come out with their words. They're thinking kinesthetically. And if you talk to them more in a kinesthetic language, maybe slow down your speech patterns a little bit, you'll make more of a connection with them, more of an effective connection with them. And the same with an auditory person. Yeah, they like to listen to what they're saying, what's being said, and they will think with sounds and the words that are being said the pitch is important. When they talk, they probably modulate their speech, the pitch and the tone of their speech that bit more than a kinesthetic person who would be a lot more on a simple plane. Notice all of these different cues, and then you will be able to identify how that person is thinking. Make sense? Yeah? Okay, brilliant. Let's move on because there's a lot that I wanted to cover. Okay, so understanding what's in the gap. In essence, basically, we're two people here talking to each other, but there's a lot going on inside the head, a lot going on inside the mind, and there's a big communication gap. There's a gap between those people. And each person will have their own way of thinking and processing their thoughts and their own way of viewing the world. And those are filters that they use. And if you understand what their filters are, you can get through those filters, and your communication is so much more effortless. As opposed to if, like I say, someone's thinking kinesthetically, another person's talking visually, then there's a disconnect and it's harder to get that connection. So understand what's in the gap. Now, that is about how we process information, okay? But there's another side that I'd like to just touch on, which is about our thinking patterns, how we perceive and interact with the world. And again, it's kind of coming down to what's beneath the iceberg. What is starting, what's happening down there? What are their, what motivates them? How, or not what motivates them, but how do they get motivated? How do they tend to think? What drives them to make a decision? We're going to touch on these key points. Now, preferred thinking strategy. You get big picture thinkers and more detailed thinkers. Some people that like to see the big picture. They like to, they just want a summary. They don't want all the detail. So they keep their conversation quite high level. They don't go down to the detail. And they want that overview, whereas the other people really like detail. They like the fine details. They want real clarity and need to know the process and every step of the process. And this comes out in what they're saying, how they talk, the words that they use. Okay, so you may find that, you know, when you're talking to your boss, that person is a big picture thinker and you are a detailed thinker. And when they're talking and they're giving you the overview of stuff, you actually want to know the detail. Or maybe it's the vice versa, and you're talking to a member of your staff or somebody else that you're talking to, and you're talking at real level of detail. Actually, they're just not interested. You've lost them because they just don't want to know. What about their thinking strategy? And again, this is about getting through the filters. If you consciously understand their thinking style, their way of, their patterns of thinking, you can then connect with them more effectively. Another one is motivation bias. So some people are driven by heading towards what they want to go, and other people are driven from running away from what they don't want. Okay. And again, this information comes out in what they're saying. So we're going to do a little exercise in a minute, but if you ask somebody about their goals and what they want to, what they're looking to achieve and why, you'll be able to find out whether they're a towards thinker or an away from thinker. And that's going to affect how you communicate with them, or it should affect how you communicate with them to get the most out of that conversation. Because if you know that they are more concerned with the risks and looking at the potential problems and they're getting away from something, then that's the way in which you should talk to them about. If you're trying to convince somebody about something, you need to talk to them about what's driving them. And if they're driven by actually because they don't want this and they don't want that, that means that actually you shouldn't be talking to about, yeah, but you can have this and you can have that, because actually that's not the way they're thinking. They think you're actually not hitting the mark. Whereas if you're talking to somebody who actually is really driven towards something as opposed to away from something, then that's what you need to be talking about. You need to be talking about the opportunity and what they'll gain and the benefits of that. And the third thinking pattern that I'd like to talk about is the decision-making process. Some people make decisions because they just know. They validate things on their own, in their own mind. They're not interested in what anyone else has to say. They're not interested in outside validation, but some other people are. Okay, there's no right and there's no wrong. It's just that they're different. And if you're talking to somebody who is looking, is always looking for external validation of things, and they don't make the decision for themselves through their own mind, they need to see what other people have to say about something. You need to provide them with that information for them to make that decision, because they can't make the decision otherwise. Now, again, just like the last slide, there's a huge there's a lot more behind this in terms of, again, the type of language that they use, their kind of characteristics in the way they look at things, and the information that they need to be able to process the content and what you have to say to them. And if you can get through those filters by understanding and talking to them in the language that they're thinking, then you will be able to get so much further with that communication and be able to influence them more, be able to be understood more easily, all of that. So this next exercise is about decoding those thinking patterns. We're going to get into small groups again, and I want you to ask each other this time. You don't need to be on camera as such, but this time it's just about asking to understand how that person is thinking. Then ask them the question, tell me about your favorite movie or your favorite book. And when they tell you about that, what do they tell you? Just answer it naturally, okay? Don't try to be one thing or try to be the other, because neither is right nor wrong. It's just, who are you? And how do you identify who they are so that you can then connect with them and communicate most effectively? So the first question is, tell me about one of your favorite movies or books. Okay? And that will tell you, based on how they okay, thank you. Thanks, Sheila. Based on how they tell you and the words that they're using, you'll be able to identify if they're thinking in a big picture way or more specifically. And then you know how to communicate most effectively with them. Similarly, if you ask them to tell you about one of their goals and why it's important. When they tell you why it's important, they'll be giving away what their motivation bias is. Are they driving towards something, or are they moving away from something? And then again, you'll know how to connect with them, how to talk to them if you want them to do something. You know what they need in order to help process that thought process. And then, how do you know when you've done a good job? How do you know when you've done a good job? Do you actually get external validation? Somebody tells you you've done a good job. You get some feedback. Or actually, no one needs to tell you. It doesn't matter, because I know if I've done well or I haven't done well. So we're going to do this little exercise, again in small groups. Thanks, Sheila, for sharing that screen. That makes it a lot easier so everybody can access the questions. And then in your little group, just ask one another those questions and take note of how they answer it, so that you're kind of be observing, but also for yourself, how you answer it and what that might mean about the way you think. And then you can have a little discussion about that. Okay, so off into breakout rooms again. Off you go. You can unmute yourselves. Eye-opening. Talking about the eyes again. Was that helpful? Was that interesting? Did you learn something about yourself? Did you notice something in others? Were you able to recognize those thinking patterns?
Karen, could I ask, does it depend on the stage of life or the situation you're in? Because when I was a kid, I think I felt like I was running towards, and now I feel like I'm running away.
Well, I mean, it can change, yes. So, really, this is all about how that person's thinking at the particular point in time. So, life happens, stuff happens, doesn't it? And we can change that thinking pattern. But it's interesting to be aware of it and to be able to identify it in ourselves as well as in other people, because it says a lot about how they're motivated. And, we all want to be heard and to be understood, but really it's not about, if you're in a communication, it's not about us, it's about them. It's about understanding how the person you're communicating with is thinking, and so that then you can communicate to them in the way that they're thinking. Then you will be understood and you will be heard in the right way. Does that make sense? Because if you have got very different thinking styles and nobody adapts their thinking in that conversation and that relationship, then it becomes quite hard, and it gets harder and harder and harder. The more adaptable you can be, the easier it is to kind of get your message across to whoever it is you're talking about, whether you're actually whether it's your personal relationships, whether it's your family, your friends, your at work, your business, whatever it might be. We all have to communicate, and the more we can understand about ourselves and others, the better. Okay, I'm very conscious of time. We're kind of running over a little bit. So if you do need to dip out, then I understand. That's fine. And if you register on this, I will send you the recording and the slides, which will have the slides on it. But if you can hang around for a little bit longer, then there's a few more bits that I'd really like to cover, if you're finding it interesting. Right. How about a little like if this is helpful, if this is useful, can you put one in the chat for me so I know I'm kind of adding some value here? Oh, that's great. Thank you. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Lovely. Good. Okay. So moving on then. So we've talked about our thinking patterns. We've talked about how we process information, our thinking style, and how we can identify some of that. Obviously, we're on camera here. We can't see that much in terms of nonverbal, but nonverbal is 93%, or whether you can debate that percentage, but it's a lot about the communication, far more than the words. Our body language reveals so much. Of our level of confidence, of our ability, our openness to receive and listen to somebody, how we're feeling. It says so much. And we inherently do have an understanding of all of this, but we don't always bring it into our conscious awareness. So some have more of an ability to read people than others. And, that's normal, that's natural. In actual fact, this is something that I wish we introduced to all our kids, because then they understand this. They can be so much more effective in their life, in any communication that they have. So, non-verbal communication, we're just going to touch on this quickly, obviously with time. Facial expressions, very fleetingly, even if we say we're happy, you can very fleetingly probably see a micro expression of people of emotion, because our faces share emotion. Okay, so even when we're saying something, if our face is saying something different, there's a disconnect. And that facial expression is normally the thing you need to look at not the words that are being used, because that is an unconscious communication cue that you pick up on. Gestures and movement, they reinforce or they contradict what we're saying. Again, just like facial expressions in some way. So if there's a disconnect between our facial movements, our gestures, and what we're actually saying, then something's not right. We all probably have met people who something doesn't gel. They don't seem to communicate. Bye, Jabo. Thanks for coming. They don't seem to, their communication doesn't seem genuine. They're not congruent with what they're saying. There's some disconnect, and that's probably because what they're consciously saying with their words and what they're unconsciously saying with these kind of hidden communication cues, that they're actually, the hidden communication cues are telling you that what they're saying is not genuine. The posture and our breathing tells a lot as well, and it also is how somebody's feeling and their level of confidence. But you can look at somebody and you can tell if they're kind of looking down and they're feeling low. Yeah, they're probably feeling low. But also remember, there's eye-accessing cues. Kinesthetic was looking down, okay, connecting with your feelings. So people that are feeling depressed will often be looking down because they're connecting with their feelings. If they're feeling low, and then it's a feeling, and they're looking at connecting with that feeling. That's their mode of thinking at that point in time. But if you got them to think, look up, look more up, don't connect with your feelings by looking down, look up, connect more with your visual field, that person will instantly start to feel a bit better. They can't not, because again, it's how the brain is working. But also we can affect our own feelings. So through our posture and our breathing, you know, if you're feeling stressed and you breathe nice and slowly, nice deep breaths, that calms you down, doesn't it? If you stand more upright, if you're feeling a bit low and lacking confidence, but you stand upright, look up instead of looking down, then actually you'll feel so much better, and you will be feeling more confident. So there's a way in which you can consciously use some of these non-verbal communication cues to your own benefit, how you feel. Because remember, what we see and what we hear affects what we think. What we think affects what we feel. Okay, so if we're looking up and we're looking more in our visual field, and we're that is going to affect how we think, which is that little bit more confident, because we're not connecting with those feelings of being uncomfortable for whatever reason. Then that's going to affect what we think, and it's going to affect what we do and how we respond. So let's say you're going to do a presentation, you're going to talk to somebody, you're going to talk to a group of people, and you're feeling very nervous and, you know, uncomfortable in that situation. It's one of life's biggest fears, isn't it? Speaking in public. And if you're feeling nervous, chances are that you're going to be looking down and connecting with that nervous feeling. Instead, take a deep breath, calm down, stand upright, look up. Don't connect with your feelings, look up. And when you're looking up, it's much easier to feel more confident, because you're not connecting with those kind of uncomfortable feelings. You're actually going to start thinking in a different plane. Remember, when we're looking up, we're thinking more visually, we're thinking more auditorily, and so the feelings, the thoughts related to our feelings don't connect so much. And then that makes it easier for you. So non-verbal cues, obviously we can't really see all of that here, but I encourage you to, with this awareness, to go out and just observe people, whether you're talking to them or not. Even if you're in a coffee shop, just watch what other people are doing, how they come across. Where are they looking? Are they looking down? They're connecting with their feelings? Are they looking up? They look confident. What kind of movements, what gestures are they making? What's it saying? This reminds me of all the teens who look down at their phones for hours and feeling, yeah, very good point. Very good point. And if they're connecting down, they're connecting with those feelings. And maybe that could well be a reason why so many people are, mental health is a big issue at the moment. But, the more upright we are, if you know somebody that's really feeling down, tell them to stand up tall, look up, and they will start to feel better. They stay looking up, access the world and access the information in their brains on a different plane. They can't help but change the way they think and change the way they're feeling. Because remember what Bob Gass said at the beginning, that what we see and what we hear affects what we think, affects what we feel, and therefore affects what we do and say. Okay, and then think about it, what we do and say affects what other people, how they react to us. Okay, and they're going to react to what we do and say, and then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it has a huge impact on who we are, how we interact with the world, and as Bob Gass says, our destiny, because it becomes our habits, our way of being, a way of thinking, our way of communicating, not just with ourselves but with other people. Okay, so you saw that picture before where there's a big gap between two people, and if you understand what's in that gap, the differences between communication styles, then you'll find that if you can match their style, then effortlessly that communication will be effortless. It just flows so easily. And I'm sure you've all met people in your life who actually, they just get it. You get on so well with them because you're probably thinking in the same way, you're communicating in the same way, and therefore what you say naturally and easily connects with them. Where there's a mismatch in your styles and your thinking pattern, and that's where the misunderstandings come into play, where there's a disconnect in that communication and that relationship. And in order to improve your communication, it's really about matching styles. And now that you have some awareness of what different people's styles are and how to identify them through those hidden communication cues, then that awareness brings in an ability for you to start to adapt your style to match their style. And if you start, that will start improving the level of communication that you have. So yes, it's what's in that gap. Oops. So effective communication is all about clearing that gap between the two people, not having filters that disconnect, but actually getting through those filters so there's no obstruction to an understanding of that conversation. So when one person says something, they say it in a way that other person receives it and understands it. As I say, a lot of this comes from something called NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and one of the tenets of neuro-linguistic programming is that the meaning of our communication is the response you get. Okay, the meaning of our communication is the response you get. That means that we are responsible for how other people understand what we're saying. And in order for us to be well understood, we need to communicate with them in a way that they think, the way they communicate, to get the best communication. And the more flexible we can be in our communication style, then the better our ability to communicate effectively, influence people, and persuade them and understand, get them to see our point of view. Because there's nothing, no filters blocking the understanding in the two persons' head, as it were. So go out there, watch, look, listen. What are people saying? How are they saying it? What are they doing? Are they talking fast? Are they looking up? Are they looking down? Are they making something up, or are they actually recalling a memory? Watch, listen, learn to understand what those cues are. And then identify those cues in people when they're saying, they want to whatever their goal is. I want to lose 20 pounds. Okay, you want to lose 20 pounds. Why? Because, yeah, I need to be healthier. But actually, the fact that you want to talk healthier means that they're driven by not being healthy. Okay, or maybe they want to look good. So they're driven by the way in which they're going to look. So all of those are cues to what's driving them and how they're thinking. And then, as I said, the most effective communicators are the ones that can fill that gap and understand how the other person's thinking, how they're communicating, how they're processing information, and then meeting them where they are. And it's not just that, also in rapport and the likes, it's the physical side too. So if you go to a coffee shop and you watch people, let's say 2 people are sitting there, or 3 people, a group of people sitting there, you might notice if they're really engaged in a conversation, they're actually doing something similar. They might both be leaning forward with their hand on their face, and they're both mirroring the physical attributes of that other person. And that's when they're really getting into rapport, because rapport isn't just about matching the communication styles. It's also the unconscious side of literally physically matching what they're doing. So some people might be sitting there, crossing their legs or leaning in, and other people might be sitting back, and the other person sitting back actually, but they're still engaged in conversation, and they're unconsciously mirroring what the other person is doing, and that gives them a level of connect as well. So I know we're way over time.